Great. Can everybody hear me? Can you understand me? Do you care? Okay, just checking the audience here a little bit. Is there any media in the audience? Whew. Okay, I was going to say if there was, my name is Royce Ramslin and I'm with General Mills. Any lawyers in the room? Okay, I think we're pretty safe then. We can go ahead with the presentation. You know how many lawyers it takes to grease a combine, don't you? 2 if you run them through really slow. I want to thank Practical Farmers for inviting me again this year. I've spent my entire career after university working primarily with oats. I grew up on a farm in northwest Iowa and went to Ohio State and then South Dakota State and worked on the oat program at South Dakota State. And in 1975, Quaker Oats hired me as an agronomist and put me on the trading floor in Minneapolis, which was a real education. And then I moved to Cedar Rapids in 1978 and worked there until 1990, managing the contract growing program that Quaker had at that time on specialty grains, particularly oats, for Quaker internationally. And in 1990, I moved to Chicago, and in 2012, of course, Quaker is owned by Pepsi, and Pepsi did one of those massive 8,000 people, layoffs in 1 week. And I became an independent agronomist for a couple of months and then got picked up by grain millers. And I really, really enjoy working for them, primarily because 90% of the grain that we buy is directly off the farm. And we prefer it that way because of the quality and the uniformity that we get. So I want to thank David for his presentation. I've got a little bit to build on to some of those points and stuff from 40 plus years of working with oats internationally. I don't have all the answers, The good news is I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm not really here to buy anything from you. And the best news is I'm not running for any political office, so I'm up here as an independent speaker today. I want to start this off by saying that, really the oat crop today is not your father's oats. My dad, the last crop of oats he raised was in 1980, and it was so full of rust that we could hardly see the combine, by the time we were done with it. A lot of stuff has changed. A little echo, okay. We're obviously using a lot larger, heavier equipment today in the farming operation. And to the questions about row spacings, I can assure you that most of the oats raised in North America today, or a large portion of it that goes into the human market, is raised up in Canada for a number of reasons. But the same trend is going on machinery-wise up there that we see down here in the States. When you go to a farm progress show or you go to, big iron shows or something like that, how many more acres can you get in an hour, or in a day? How many, how can we finance this for you? There's a big trend in Canada to go to 9 to 11-inch row spacings. Why? Because you can pull a 40-foot toolbar or a 60-foot toolbar with the same four-wheel drive tractor. Now, what does that do to the grain yield? What does that do to the quality of the grain? They don't know. They don't care. But I can get more acres an hour done. So that's a trend, and that in a lot of cases, when it comes to particularly small grain production and when it comes to grain quality, is counterproductive. The questions about narrower row spacing, yeah, it really does depend upon your particular system. Are you doing an underseeding or not? But one of the things that I really find interesting in Canada now, even though they're going to those 40 and 60-foot toolbars, they're going to 2-row spacings with shovels that are dribbling seed at 2.5 to 3 inches apart so that they're still getting that root growth down below. And we'll talk about why that's so important with oats in a little bit. I'll back that up a minute. Larger planting equipment, equipment width, placement, crop row width, new varieties, targeted usage. I'm a miller, so I have a specific interest in specific varieties. We'll go into that a little bit and why some of these varieties are important to us and why some of them really don't work for us on the milling side. New cropping patterns, rotations. You know, particularly if you go a little bit further north in Minnesota, the Dakotas are getting real interested in canola, maybe in places of soybeans. They're finding out that some of these crops use an uptake fertilizer a whole lot different than what we thought. For instance, canola is a huge user of sulfur. If you're putting oats into a rotation with canola, you really got to up the sulfur rate to get the same yields and the same test weights. Plant disease pressures have changed. Basically, they've increased. David talked about the Puccinia pathway. Well, guess what? The USDA does still a very good job of monitoring that every year. Matter of fact, they've already put out the first publication on the crown rust and stem rust that's occurring down in Texas and Louisiana and Florida, because that's where the crown rust really starts. You know, the crop is active, the winter oats are actively growing down in those states. But the majority of the crown rust that we deal with, the races that we're dealing with in Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, typically are from that buckthorn alternate crop or alternate host scenario. So if you've got a neighbor that's got a big windbreak full of buckthorn, and you notice in a couple of weeks of the year that those things have turned orange, well, you've got crown rust, Puccinia spores, just livid, that'll take care of about 10 acres for you, or excuse me, 10 miles. New harvesting and storage capabilities, and I want to talk about that a little bit more in depth when we get into it, because quite honestly, you can do absolutely everything right as far as picking a variety, getting it in timely, doing everything right, and you can ruin a crop in about 2 silly steps in the storage and harvesting process. Quality specs have changed a little bit. I want to go into that and hopefully help you understand why some of these specs are there. You know, the comment about having a clover smell in the oats, that is an old USDA outdated standard that only affected the horse industry. You know, you bring a sample of grain to our mill in St. Ansgar, and it's got a little bit of clover seed or whatever in it, that's foreign material, you know, or weed seed, you know, unless of course it's wet and it's steeped in the tank or something like that. Then you've got an aroma that you can't get rid of. And then I'm not going to get into climate change or whatever, but obviously the weather has changed in the last few years as far as what our capabilities are to adapt to some of the changes in our production cycle in comparison to the climate. As I mentioned, a lot of the oats today, for instance, Quaker, most of General Mills are buying most of their oats in this area right here, southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan. There's still a big area in the Dakotas here, but a lot of that oats there never leaves the farm. Winds up staying, being used for livestock feed. Pretty tough to buy a lot of oats out of that country. Freight-wise is part of it. The Wisconsin Valley, well, we're seeing a little bit of a resurge, a little bit more interest in oats again, particularly in the area of crop rotation, sustainability, cover crops, this sort of thing. Northwest Iowa, southwest Minnesota, this is where I really started my career, contract growing oats. Used to be a lot of oats, and every May I'm fortunate enough to be able to get on a bus here in Spencer, Iowa and go all the way up to the northern boundary waters with my brother. And last year, the end of May, when we went up there, I counted 4 oat fields all the way up there. 4, you know. And I'm not sure that they were, you know, what they were being raised for. So yeah, the decline is there. This is just showing you the harvested acreage going back to only 1988. And in 1990, we saw a huge decline in U.S. production right after the '88 drought. And we started investing in this program called ethanol. And in Canada, we saw it go up. And why did we see that change in 1990? And why did we see all of a sudden companies like the big mill over here in Cedar Rapids say we're no longer going to buy U.S. domestic oats? Because the Canadian Wheat Board got out of the oat business and said, who cares about oats? Mr. Farmer, you can sell those down to the U.S. if you want to directly or through a grain company. You don't have to wait for the Wheat Board to tell you what to do with it. So we had a huge influx in the 90s, early 90s, of Canadian oats. And these Canadian oats were 41, 42, 43 pounds in test weight. They were bright and plump. And the racehorse industry went that fast to only Canadians is all that they would buy. So we saw some economic changes that drove that. We're still seeing a trend decline in oat production because southern Manitoba, southern Ontario have found this miracle crop called corn, and they are raising corn up there. Early 90s when I started traveling up there, you'd see a crop of corn and you go, well, that's interesting. We'd call it a 2-year crop, 1 year to grow it and 1 year to mature it up there. Now, look at the billions of dollars that Pioneer right down the road here and Monsanto right down the road here at Ankeny are spending on earlier hybrids, primarily destined for the ethanol industry, but earlier maturity on the corn hybrids. So they're going more and more corn up there. Also southern Manitoba and a lot of Ontario, huge factory farms, if you will, in the pork industry. A lot of the pork that even we consume here in Iowa and Illinois is coming across the border there from those huge factory farm swine operations. Oat production obviously pretty much mirrors the acreage. One that I find a little interesting though and depressing is the yield one. We don't have a biotech oat. There's no such thing as a GMO oat anywhere in the world. And I travel the world and I fund oat research worldwide. And when I was with Quaker, we funded Ken Fry's program here. And then Jean-Luc Janik, when Jean-Luc took over the oat program when Ken retired. And then when Jean-Luc decided to get a real paying job with USDA, and guess what? Corn research out at Cornell, Iowa State said, nah, nobody's interested in oats anymore, and they discontinued the program. This last summer, we at Grain Millers had the opportunity to work with the PFI group, and we had the Secretary of Ag from Iowa here, Mr. Northey, come. And I hate to tell you this, but he didn't even know that Iowa State didn't have an oat breeder up until, a couple of weeks before the visit and stuff on it. So that's kind of the status of interest from Iowa State in oats, except for the research that David and some of the folks that are doing that are being funded by PFI. So congratulations on that. Okay, so from an agronomist standpoint for a food company, here's what it takes. You've got to have a strategy that includes rotation because, if Joel gets up here later or any ag economist, the problem with most ag economists is they compare year to year to year, crop to crop to crop in silos. Unfortunately, a small grain production, particularly oats, doesn't fit into a 1-year crop rotation because you've got to consider the soil, you've got to consider the rotational benefits, you've got to consider long-term marketing. One of my biggest frustrations with oats, particularly, is as a farmer, you're marketing corn 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year. A bin here, a bin there, a little bit here, a little bit there. 90% of the oat farmers in the Midwest sell oats 1 time a year. And that's usually at harvest. And when's the lowest price for oats? At harvest. We do it to ourselves. You've got to have a strategy around marketing that we tend not to have. Field selection, Yeah, I'm a big supporter of oats following soybeans because you can get them in a little bit earlier versus all the trash that we've got out there in high-yield cornfields today. That ground stays wet, stays cooler. Oats will germinate at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but it likes to see a little bit of sunlight, and it likes to have some warm temperatures continue. Variety selection will go into that. Weed control strategy. In an organic system, that's tough. But the primary thing to remember with weed control in oats is early stands, a very good ground cover to choke out some of those weeds. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the mechanical methods that I'm seeing used, particularly in Northern Europe today, where they're actually using a spike tooth harrow and going in and very accurately taking stuff out. Saskatchewan has got a fairly growing industry in organic production. And one of my former colleagues up there, Dr. Steve Shirtliff, has done a lot of work with a rotary hoe, which we had to introduce to them up there because they had no concept what a rotary hoe actually looked like. But a lot of work on both cross and in-row harrowing and finding very, very good results. But you got to do it early in the season, not when that oats is already in the third and fourth leaf stage and you go, oh crap, I got to get out there until it's too late. And then harvesting and storage, and we'll go into that. Field selection. Choose fields that are relatively free of wild oats. Well, we don't have a big problem with that in most of Iowa. We really don't have the wild oat pressures. We want it with a minimum of herbicide residue carryovers, and if there's one benefit out of all the overuse and abuse of glyphosate and Liberty in the last few years, we don't see a lot of carryover on small grains. You know, 20 years ago when I tried to put oats back on my parents' farm in northwest Iowa, and they hadn't had oats for about 10 years, I wanted to put in because I did some terracing on the land. And it was corn the year before and the beans the year before that. And the oats got about that tall and keeled over dead on a doornail. And of course, the phone call from Dad that morning wasn't particularly pleasant, you know. What the hell's wrong with this oat variety? You know, you told me to put on this fertilizer, da-da-da. Turns out we did some soil sampling. We had such a synergistic buildup of trifluralin and triazine compounds, the atrazine that we'd used for years and the treflan and those sorts of things that just stayed in that soil for several years that never allowed small grain growth. I, for one, believe that's what's happened to a lot of our yields in Iowa over the years. We had such a buildup of some of these compounds that we never had a chance for the genetic potential to come forward. It still frustrates me. Even when Ken was here at Iowa State and we did research out on the West Farm, we could do 150, 160, 180 bushel per acre in test plots out there. And the state average yield was 68 bushel per acre. You know, what the hell are we doing wrong? You know, we're not considering everything there was with that soil. Oats are a very desirable rotation crop. Further north, there's research going on, and I'm trying to get some stuff going here in the Midwest as well. They know for a fact that oats and rotation reduces soil aphanomycetes in the sugar beet rotations. There is anecdotal information that it's reducing soybean cyst and nematode populations in soils that are high potential in that. Now, is that a chemical, hormonal? Just the fact that oats have a very deep root system, very fibrous root system? I don't know the answers to that. I don't know that anybody does yet, but we know that farmers that have said that I put that into my rotation, all of a sudden it did a lot better on the soybean cyst nematode problems. Oats can tolerate a cooler, wetter soil, and again, it can germinate cooler than wheat or barley. Clean seed, we do recommend certified seed. And I'm not here to sell you seed. That's not my business. But I hear story after story of farmers that, I got that seed from John down the road there 5 miles. And, we did the wet paper towel test, and it was about 88, 89% germination on it and stuff. But then it didn't grow well to start with. There's a difference between germination and viability, particularly when it comes to a crop that you're trying to germinate and get started and get an early establishment early on. If you're not using at least clean seed, where that seed is very uniform in size, its uniformity in the plumpness of it, and uniformity in the germination, it's like taking a pocket full of change and throwing it out there and seeing whether you got $1 or whether you got $5. It depends upon the uniformity of that clean seed. If not organic, I do endorse the use of a fungicide for smut. Oats respond well to some of the bacterial-based inoculants. There's more and more studies being done in Minnesota on that all the time. It seems like it's helping the oats get off to an earlier start with a healthy start. Some of the biologics, I know there are going to be questions about that. I see mixed results. I really encourage you to look at what that biologic is offering, what they're really trying to address, whether it's worth it on your farm. And timing is everything. You've got to know when you're putting it on and any chemical onto a crop. Early seeding, the best oats we always had in northwest Iowa was when we seeded on my birthday, which was the 18th of March. Now, a lot of years there was 6 foot of snow on the ground at that point in time, and you couldn't get in there. But at the same point in time, early oats are going to beat a lot of the disease cycle. It's going to beat a lot of that early germination growth cycle of the weed seeds as well. We'll get into a little bit of the physiology in a little bit longer. But anything you do to that crop after the 4th leaf stage, when that panicle primordium is starting to go up the main stem, you're going to do irreversible damage, whether that's chemical, environmental from frost, driving over it, or whatever. Anything up to the 4th leaf stage, that's all vegetative, okay? And it'll come back. The rate, just like David, we see 2.5 to 3.5. But your goal, the real goal here in the Midwest is 18 to 23 plants per square foot for a final stand. Now, I've looked at a lot of research on the tillering. Is a tiller a good thing or not? It all depends upon when that tiller forms and whether you have nutrients available for that tiller at the time that that tiller is coming out. The same formula that David had up, use it. Because if you're buying 32-pound seed from the neighbor or you're buying 40-pound seed from Albert Lee Seed House, you're going to have a big, big difference in the amount of material you're putting down and what you should expect for a final stand. Okay, let's talk about the oat kernel itself. A little bit of the physiology. The oat kernel, the primary thing that everyone as a miller or even the feed industry is concerned about is the center meat of that kernel called a groat, G-R-O-A-T. Around that groat are 2 pieces of a hull. There's the lemma, which is this portion out here, which is kind of like a canoe, and then the palea on the inside. If you look at an oat kernel, you'll see that. Now, it depends upon the variety. Some varieties will have a little hook up here on the top of the lemma. Some of them will have a little more hook on the palea. As a miller, we want to have the minimum amount of hull and the maximum amount of this groat, because the hull, essentially, other than like our fiber mill up in St. Ansgar where we're making oat fiber, out of some of the hulls. Most of that winds up going to poultry litter, to bedding, particularly up in Wisconsin, or it winds up going into the feed industry. It's really just a cellulosic fiber that we can't do much with, okay? The average oat variety out there today is going to have somewhere between 68 to 72% groat by weight, and about 20 to 25% or a little higher hull, okay? Varieties vary in that, and as a grower you need to understand that, because that can affect your test weight going forward, okay? So this is our variety list for 2016. Our preferred varieties: Badger, Spurs, Sabres, Dion. That's more or less in the early to mid-season. A little bit later, Hayden, Shelby 427s, Newburgh, and Rockfords. Now, why are they on our preferred list? For a couple of reasons. One, we can get the hull off of them quite easily. There are other varieties like Jerry. Jerry's a very popular North Dakota line that came out in the early 1990s. Dr. Mike McMullen brought that out, and it was a great yielder, and it stood. For a North Dakota variety that can get this tall, it stood great. And guess what? It had what they called the PC68 crown rust resistance gene in it. The only downfall to it was the only crown rust resistance gene it had in it, and in 1 year's time that thing went from being resistant to crown rust to being a magnet. I mean, if you got crown rust, Jerry was going to have it. It was going to have it early on, and it's going to be a problem. The other problem from the miller's standpoint is you need a sledgehammer to get the hull off that bugger, okay? So when it comes time for us to mill it, it's got to go through the dehullers a couple of times. When you can't get the hull off of the oat and you wind up breaking that groat up, you can't make as many flakes. You can't make as many groats. Now, to a miller like General Mills, who's only interested in making flour, Cheerios, they don't care if that groat is broken up. But for a Quaker or a grain millers or a lacrosse milling, where we're trying to make flakes for cereal bars or whatever, if you break that groat up, it winds up going to flour, and that's a loss of what we refer to as mill yield. Some of these on the acceptable list, the only reason they're on acceptable is we haven't had enough volume of them individually to say they really perform well. Again, we're a dry milling process, and I'll go into that a little bit later on. Hopefully Jesse Vanderpool, one of my colleagues, is going to give the presentation on the marketing end of it. I'm hoping, but she had a car breakdown a little earlier today, so we're hoping that she makes it here. If not, I've got her PowerPoint presentation, and unfortunately you're going to have to listen to me on that one. But what we tell you on these varieties is uniformity is key. The more uniform we can have these varieties come in, intrinsic physical characteristics as well as varietal, the better the mill yield is for us. So Beta Gene's a new one out of Wisconsin. We had it in the trials, the PFI trials this year. We think it's fairly good. Okay. Colt, Illinois, Horsepower, South Dakota, TAC, Illinois, Souris, North Dakota, Excel, and this will be available as well. Really? 5 minutes, okay. Let me talk about fertility. Generally speaking, we don't have a lot of problem with nitrogen in Iowa, availability on oats. Matter of fact, a lot of times we have a little bit too much because we complain about the oats lodging. What we do tend to have a lack of is enough phosphate and potassium. Some of the best oat yields I've heard in the last few years are the farmers that are using some poultry litter because of that higher phosphate and potassium. You got to understand, nitrogen is directly responsible for plant height, protein, and yield. okay? Phosphorus is directly responsible for root growth, root depth, and standability. Potassium is not a plant cell component that you can take it apart and find potassium. But what potassium does do is a catalyst to allow phosphate and nitrogen to work. And also on the bottoms of the guard cells, on the bottoms of the leaves of the oat plant, the primary nutrient that controls the opening and closing of those stoma is potassium. So if you have a plant that is starving for potassium at any stage of growth, and you see some stress from heat, from water deficiency, from chemical, you'll see that plant transpire faster. Well, if those guard cells can't open and close, the plant literally sweats itself. All right, so you've got to have that. And then sulfur, the last 10 years we found out how really important sulfur is in oat production. The main thing out of this, for a 100 bushel oat crop, you have to have a minimum of 73 pounds of nitrogen, 27 pounds of available P2O5, 18 pounds of K2O, 4 pounds of magnesium, and 7 pounds of sulfur. Those are plant food basics. Weed control, if you're conventional, 2,4-D and MCPA really are the best two options in the amine formulation. Oats do not tolerate ester formulations at all. Banville or dicamba, I'm a little iffy on, because if you don't get that on really early, if you wait until the 4th or 5th leaf stage, you will see more blasting on the heads, okay, because it affects the kernel fill, interrupts that. Primary diseases, crown rust, a good example of that. Fungicides do work. I'm a little skeptical on headline only from the standpoint of if it's very hot when you put it on, you will see some leaf burn from the headline. I like Stratego because of the 2 modes of action that that's got. Remember, none of these are preventative. They're all curative. So you need to see the crown rust before you apply. But if you wait, 4 or 5 days after you start seeing pustules, it's probably a little too late for the plant as well. Swathing and storage. I really want to hit this concept of storage. I see more oats go out of condition in the bins every year than I see go out of condition in the field due to an agronomic standpoint. The best method to store an oat is still in an old wooden bin. Why? Because that bin breathes, okay? These nice big shiny crock pots that we've built out here in the country today. When Dirk Meyer was at Purdue yet, Dirk started doing a lot of studies at Purdue on these bins and the sun on a day like today, particularly when we get into April, March and April. 1 foot in, we can see a 7-degree Fahrenheit change in that temperature. What happens when you get 7 degrees of temperature change? You get moisture formation. And we see a lot of grain go out of condition, particularly on the south sides of bins. The other thing that I really don't like is all these grain bags we're starting to see out there in the country. Works great for the farmer that's farming 30 miles away and he can put grain in the bag at the end of the field. Those things are supposed to be anaerobic, providing there's no bugs and no varmints come up and put a little hole in that bag. Then you've got a self-feeder, out of it. Getting to be very, very popular up north. Drying, I do like drying of oats. If you're harvesting it a little bit wetter, I'd like to see oats stored between 12 and 13 moisture. But you never heat the grain over 110 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in that process. Remember, farmers raise a crop. As a grain buyer, we buy an ingredient because everything we buy is intended to go into somebody's mouth. Our specs, I'm going to wait and do this part when we get in with Jesse, because some of these are USDA, some of them really do affect the milling quality. But to be a strategic supplier, understand who the customer is and what drives our decisions to buy, understand the customer's definition of quality, understand the differences between a crop and an ingredient, fully understand and be able to document your market, your crop, and your capabilities better than your competitors. That's why we buy directly from the farm. Food purchasing is the most year-round process affecting consumers that we've got. Grain marketing should also be a year-round process. And we'll get into the milling portion of it later. All right, open it up for questions.
You said uniformity was key?
Hold on.
You said uniformity was key, and I was wondering, does that mean you can't plant a couple different varieties in the same field?
I would never plant two varieties in the same field unless they are so identical as far as maturity is concerned. You got to remember, oat physiology is different than corn physiology in the maturity process. Wheat and barley dry from the bottom up. Oats dries from the top down. Okay? So if you've got different maturities, either from different varieties or a different, let's say you had a late tiller situation, and you've got these primaries that are standing up there in that big glooms, those outside hulls are turning white, and you see that gloom fall off and that kernel fall off, and you think, oh my God, I got to get in there and harvest. Well, 90% of your yield is in the bottom 2/3 of that panicle, that Christmas tree type head. If that has not reached physiologic maturity yet, you're going to suffer test weight, you're going to suffer a lot of greens, you're going to suffer a lot of issues. Now, what they've gone to in Canada, which drives us nuts, but it's legal, is they're going in and desiccating the crop for either the fact that they're putting together a couple different varieties to try to get an early short one in there to hold up some of the taller, ranker ones, or they don't want to invest in the swathing anymore. I just want to go out there and hit it with the combine. The glyphosate, we have found, even though there's a tolerance in both the US and Canada as far as food safety, and I'm not here to talk about food safety, I'm here to talk about the physiologic change in that oat growth. If you hit it too early, like at that pre-physiologic maturity point, above 30% moisture, it's doing the same thing as hitting it with a frost. You're going to suffer test weight. You're going to wind up with shrunken, shriveled kernels. And we did some studies at University of Minnesota that shows that the starch molecules are completely different in an immature oat than they are in a regular. For a miller like us that's trying to make flakes, when we go to the mill with that, even though the oat looks okay physically, we have a little more green hull to it. When we try to dehull it, it powders up because your starch protein bonds are destroyed, okay? So effective this last year, grain millers, and we're catching a tremendous amount of media and grain company heat. We're not allowing oats to be treated with glyphosate as a desiccant prior to harvest. And I can't tell you the indigestion that's caused us as a company, but we believe it's the right thing to do. So, long answer to a simple question, no, please don't blend varieties.
Kind of relating to that, what effect does, say, swathing right at maturity versus letting it stand to dry and then direct cutting have on your quality and test weight?
I wish there was more studies done on that. We know from a lot of research that's been done over the years with rice, the differences between direct cutting that and putting it into a swath and allowing it to dry is at the end of the maturization, physiologic maturity standpoint, when the peduncle that David talked about is maturing and drying down, there are still fructans moving out of that stem up into the grain. And you will see potentially, if you're swathing it too early, when that peduncle's not completely done, you will see some physiologic changes in the particularly the bottom tier of kernels there. Lighter test weights immature kernels a little more green. If the plant is physiologically mature, what you will tend to see is a little more chaff in the direct swath, or excuse me, in the direct cut versus the direct combine. Now, having said that, I've been working with some farmers that were right at that borderline, you know, that 34, 35, 36 pound test weights, both in swath and direct. We've let those oats set for a month in the bin, get uniformly dry down to that 12, 13 by running some air on them, taking the header off the combine, driving the feeder housing right up to the auger, setting down the concaves just a little bit, turning up the fan speed and picking up 3 pounds of test weight and nothing flat. Okay? You've got this $500,000 machine that you want to go out and gather the crop, and you're not using it for the grain cleaning capabilities that a lot of them can do. Unfortunately, you can't find that in the owner's manual. Just doesn't happen. So it depends upon the moisture of the crop when you swath it versus direct cut it.
Why do small grains go into a sweat after harvest?
Well, if you talk to several plant physiologists, they tell you it doesn't sweat, because a plant can't sweat. Well, the fact of the matter is, what you're seeing is where the rachilla, the growing point, attaches to the tip of the kernel of oats. There is a starch protein bond change there that causes shrinkage at different levels. That is physiologically what's going on with the sweat. Will there be moisture movement? It can be if the moisture's high enough, but that's just an evapotranspiration effect. True story. We bought more oats out of Iowa this last year than we have the last 5 combined, okay? A lot of the work with PFI, a lot of the work with a better crop this last year than the previous years, a little less crown rust in several areas. The millers, I'm at a conference in Minnesota, and the millers from St. Ansgar called and went, "What the hell's going on? We can't get the hull off of this oats." And I went, what oats? "Well, these new crop domestic oats that the buyers are buying." And I said, "You're running new crop domestic oats already?" When I was at Cedar Rapids we wouldn't touch a domestic oat for 6 weeks to 2 months after harvest because the oats has to go through, and the old-time millers would talk about the sweat. Well, guess what? Those domestic oats are running a whole lot better now, than they did before. That's why I was talking about a month or so after those oats went into the bin of trying to clean them up a little bit. You got to get air on them right away instead of just putting them in the crock pot and thinking you got money in the bank. Get some air on them, and then if you want to try to upgrade them, do it then.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Clark, I'll give it to you.
I was wondering if you had any recommendations about the bin floor, and if there's something I should pay attention to with regard to that, as well as fan capacity.
Yeah, both of them are very important. I am not the bin expert that somebody like John Ganatke down the road here at Ankeny is. John does a lot of work for Pioneer and John Deere, both on grain bin design and how many CFM you need to have for every crop and at what time of the year. And it all depends upon the humidity and the temperatures, and when you're warming the grain or cooling the grain and that sort of thing. That's a whole school in and of itself. John puts out a very nice little booklet that if you contact Pioneer, they'll send you the book and stuff on it, on bin capacities. We allude to it just a little bit in our new manual. By the way, this is the first time I've seen this today. We wrote this and edited it over the course of the last year from grain millers. I've got 40 copies of it with me here today, free of charge to somebody that's really interested in oat production. A lot of my presentations in there. We did it loose leaf because it's our intent. And I would, if you want to pick one of these up, I want your name, address, and email address because I want to send out updates to this every year. That's the only reason. We're not going to contact you other than if we have changes, like in some of the chemical applications or whatever. We want to be able to send that out to you. But there's a lot of information on the grain bin stuff. Mostly not, what not to do and stuff. It's a whole lot different storing oats in the overhead bins in the granary that Dad had versus putting them in a 50,000 bushel steel crock pot out here today.